all for coming to this is what is the last of our lunchtime lecture programme for the Theatre and Craftsman exhibition, because that finishes. Amazing how quick the last 6 months have gone, but it finishes in 4 weeks' time. So absolutely delighted to have Chris here, who's going to talk to us about the York Viking Centre. 40 years, I believe it's in May, is it 40 years tomorrow?
It was 40 years on Sunday.
On Sunday. Which is, we're already looking forward to hearing that. So I'll just say that there is no planned fire exit, fire alarm. So if it does go off, then we do need to vacate the building. But Rebecca and I will make sure that, and I can see, we'll make sure that we all vacate the building safely, either this way or through the door at the back, which will also take you to a fire exit. So without further ado,
Thank you, Rose, and thank you all for coming along today, whether in person or online. We've really enjoyed working with North Lincolnshire Museum on the Theatre and Craftsman exhibition. Hopefully you've all had a chance to see that now, and it's been lovely to be invited back to speak, if not exactly on the anniversary of York opening, then within the anniversary year, which, as I say, started on Sunday. So Sunday the 14th of April, 14th of April 1984 was when York first opened its doors to visitors. Sunday the 14th of April 2024 was therefore our 40th birthday. But this is me, Chris Tuckley, Head of Interpretation and Learning for York Archaeology. So that's the banner organisation that owns and operates York Viking Centre and its sister attractions. It's also an archaeological unit, and it does all the things that archaeological units do, as well as running attractions as well. I've always worked on the attractions and events side of the business, and next month I'll have been with York Archaeology and with Jorvik for 20 years. So I've worked there for a long time. I've seen a lot of changes, some of which I'll talk about today. But the focus, I think, will be on the early days of the Jorvik project and how it came into being 40 years ago. Hopefully you've all visited Jorvik at some point. Lots of you know. Has anyone like to admit to not having ever visited Jorvik? Oh my goodness.
So I don't know how that happened.
We'll let you off the hook for today because you come along to the talk, so you'll get to see what Jorvik was like, Jorvik version 1. But my role for Jorvik, at least in my current role, Head of Interpretation and Learning, I look after things like the teams who deliver the formal learning programme for our school groups. We have lots of school groups visiting Jorvik and its sister sites, predominantly Key Stage 2, because that's when Vikings tend to crop up in the national curriculum for history. I look after exhibition content and messaging, so that's within our own attractions, but also partner venues where we sometimes tour our exhibitions. I'm quite heavily involved in the York Viking Festival. I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on. And any events or partnerships that are sort of explicitly on an academic or a learning theme, they're the ones that tend to involve me. So that's me in a nutshell. Should you have the first slide, please? So to tell the story of Jorvik, really, you have to go back a little bit further in time, before 1984. In fact, we need to go back into the 1970s. The images we're seeing here are of the Coppergate dig. So this is the site where the York Viking Centre now stands, and the dig was happening between 1976 and 1981. But we can go back even further than that. You know, that's 1972, which was when York Archaeological Trust came into being for the first time. So York Archaeological Trust, or York Archaeology as it's now known, celebrated its 50th birthday in 2022. And it was set up for the purpose of doing what's termed rescue archaeology. So York was undergoing a lot of change in the early mid-70s and beyond the 1980s. A lot of old building stock was being pulled down to make way for new shopping developments, to make way for changes to how traffic was managed in the city centre, making York fit really as a tourist and shopping destination for the second half, or the last quarter, I suppose, of the 20th century. So in 1972, one of the very first jobs that York Archaeological Trust did was to excavate a long and narrow trench on the site of Lloyd's Bank in Piccadilly. I don't know if you know the layout of York at all, but that's not far from Coppergate. So you've got Coppergate's a street that runs along the top here. This street here is All Saints Pavement, which is the next street up. And then over this side, so if we're looking at this picture, but imagining the road running down here, that's Piccadilly. And at the junction of Piccadilly and Pavement is the Lloyds Bank, and a new bank vault was being constructed. So the archaeologists went in and they dug a very deep, long, narrow trench. And what they found from looking at that was that the archaeological levels were really waterlogged and oxygen poor. And that's partly because this part of York is so near the River Foss. York is a confluence of two rivers, the Ouse and the Foss. And in this part of York, the soils, as a result of that, very, very wet. So there's not much oxygen in them. Also, because York's been densely occupied for the best part of 2,000 years, you get these occupational layers that are sort of pancaked down on top of one another. And again, this helps to, well, it means that the soils don't drain well at all. They get very waterlogged, and what you essentially get is like a time capsule effect with the soil, because the kinds of microorganisms and bacteria that break things down in the soil, they don't do at all well in these soils in York. So actually things that normally rot away to dust very quickly are preserved very well in the soils. And on the Lloyds Bank side, what they found was the levels from the city's Anglo-Scandinavian period. So this is the period between when the city is captured by the Viking Great Army in 866, and then the city's capture by William the Conqueror in the period immediately around the Northern Conquest, 1066, 1069, really. So the Anglo-Scandinavian period, or the Viking period, occupies a 200-year chunk of York's history. And what the archaeologists at Lloyds Bank found is that the layers from within that period were really well preserved. Now, this is a period that some of you may have heard referred to as the Dark Ages, or falling within the Dark Ages. And that's a term that isn't very much in fashion nowadays. I think because it implies that, well, what does it imply? It implies there's not much going on. People aren't doing much. We can't find out much about it because it's shrouded in darkness. It falls between the glories of the Roman Empire and then the Renaissance or the high medieval period that comes after. So it's rather depressingly been referred to as the Dark Ages. Nowadays we term it the Viking or Anglo-Scandinavian period or early medieval period. And those layers were well preserved. And what did the archaeologists find? And loads of rubbish. So really well preserved contents of rubbish pits. They found the remains of buildings and workshops, and they found the contents of rubbish pits and cesspits, including one of the star finds that we now have on display at the JORVIK Viking Centre. I can see from the smiles around some people already know what I'm referring to here. It's got its own Wikipedia page. It's the LBT, or the Lloyds Bank turd. So this, I'm told, I'm not an archaeologist, so I'll get to that now. I'm told by my archaeologist colleagues that it's the largest coprolite ever found, at least it's suspected to be produced by a human. So it's quite impressive. I think we term it an eco-fact, wouldn't you? Not an eco-fact. From looking at this really well preserved remains in the rubbish pits and cesspits, we do get very intimate insights of a kind into what life was like in this period. So there are gaps. You know, we don't know from looking at this kind of evidence, for instance, how these people refer to themselves. What do they call themselves? We don't know. We don't even really know what language they were speaking. We can make educated guesses, and we don't know how many people there were. We don't know what religion they followed, if any at all. Lots and lots of gaps that we've attempted to fill in various ways since. But what I'm getting around to saying is that as a result of this dig at the Lloyds Bank site, there was very good reason to think that when the Coppergate site became available, when the old Victorian boiled sweet factory on this site was pulled down, there's very good reason to think similar archaeology would be found here. The archaeologists were meant to be on the Coppergate site for 6 months in the event they stayed for 5 years because of the quantity and quality of the archaeology that was being brought to light here. And a quick sidebar on the archaeology is you can see what was being done to help fund the work of the archaeologists at this very early stage. It's been turned into a tourist attraction. So there are viewing galleries here, This is heritage tourism in the 70s and 80s. At a time, really, I think when at that time, if you were going for a heritage day out, you'd go to a conventional museum, probably things in glass cases, or you'd go to a place that was high status, castle, a Roman villa, a stately home, a cathedral. Certainly, you wouldn't be seeing. Next slide, please. You wouldn't be seeing the remains of houses, fairly humble houses and workshops from over 1,000 years ago. So these are the dwellings and workplaces of everyday people. So this was quite new to have this on show in this way, and to have this period being brought to light. You may have noticed as well the sign that was near the viewing gallery in the previous slide. Did anyone notice how it had been branded?
The dig.
It wasn't just the dig, Viking dig, yeah. So even though every period in York's history was represented within the levels of the Coppergate dig, the Vikings was zeroed in upon very quickly because people like Viking stuff. And it is a special feature of the Coppergate dig. There's no doubt about that. But very quickly it became clear that there was this enormous public interest and appetite finding out about these Vikings in our midst, these Vikings that belong to us, that are part of our history, part of our city of York. So I think all of this was quite novel. So let's have a quick look at what was being brought to light. We've got here remains about the building, and some of these timber buildings survived to about 8 meters long and 2 meters high. So that's pretty considerable. Really, when you think that, these buildings aren't well represented in the archaeological record elsewhere. Let's have the next slide, please. One of the famous cesspits here, something that I may mention this again later, something that the archaeologists who worked on Coppergate always remark upon is the smell of the site. So even though these remains are 1,000 years old or thereabouts, when these pits were opened, they smelt fresh. So that just goes to show the level of preservation. And also, I think it probably sows this initial seed around York as a smelly place. And that's obviously something that we've continued to this day. Okay, next slide, please. And then I've picked this as just one of the key small finds from Coppergate. That's just illustrative, really, of how strange it is as a site that you can lift a sock, 1,000-year-old sock, out of the ground that's been preserved, and then you can submit that sock to very detailed research and work out that it's been produced using a single needle knitting technique that's still practiced in Scandinavia, but that isn't particularly well known in the British Isles. So possibly came over on the foot of a traveller from Scandinavia, which matches with all of the historical evidence that we've got for who was around in York in this period. We know before this Viking Great Army, and have then been settled, by Vikings, and their descendants have lived there for a long time afterwards. Very rare for textiles to come out of the ground. But speaking in terms of bulk finds, 5 tons of animal bones came out of the Coppergate dig site. Vast quantities of oyster shells. I've seen the number 750,000 oyster shells mentioned here, which suggests that oysters were almost like a snack food in this period. They were a delicacy in the way that they are today. Thousands of Roman and medieval roof tiles, woven wattles of the kind that we saw incorporated into that cesspit, but they were used for walls, pathways, screens, building timbers, which went on to be conserved by our conservation lab. Metalworking slag, smithing and smelting slag, 250,000 pieces of pottery, and 2,500 soil samples recorded for further analysis. So that material remains available to researchers today. We continue to care for that collection. So when the Coppergate dig was operating as a visitor attraction in its own right, it attracted 500,000 visitors. And around this time as well, there were a couple of spin-off exhibitions in York, and then that toured as well, both in the UK and overseas. But the Yorkshire Museum had a Viking Kingdom of York exhibition in 1976. That attracted 78,000 visitors. And then the Vikings in England exhibition there in 1982, 235,000 visitors. So these are serious numbers really for museums in York. So all of this together is making the case very strongly that there's an appetite for something permanent to be established. And this is when the idea of the JORVIK Viking Centre is born really. And Peter Addiman, he's the director of York Archaeology Trust, who's still very active in York, and he went back to York on Sunday for the to have a glass of champagne with some colleagues from 1984. He had said very early on that it shouldn't be called a museum. That was the advice he was getting. It should be a Viking centre, because the word museum, and apologies to flies today, connotes, or at least in those days, maybe less so now, connotes a dusty place with objects behind glass. Therefore, less exciting, less interesting than what the archaeology would point to or suggest. Can we have the next slide, please? So this is the option for a museum, a permanent exhibition that was acceptable to the City of York Council. And Weekly Property Holdings were the developer. A key personality who became involved in the very early stages was a guy called Ian Skipper, who was a Lancashire entrepreneur. I think he'd been in the automotive side of things. He initially got in touch because he was interested in coming and digging on the Coppergate dig site, but he quickly came to understand that actually his skills in raising funds would be of use here, and he was instrumental in coming up with a model for permanent attraction that would be financially viable. So he devised a scheme that depended on 500,000 visitors annually, and there was a grant of £250,000 from the English Tourist Board that helped to secure a further 4 million in loans. So I don't know what that is in today's money, but bearing in mind this is back in the early 1980s. So it's considerable. Can we have the next slide, please? This shows the floor plan. And actually, this is the floor plan that we still work with today. One of the limitations of JORVIK is that it does fit in concrete box within the footprint of the Coppergate dig. So you can't just expand it willy-nilly, unfortunately, even if visitor numbers seem to warrant that. So this was the format in 1984, and although there have been many changes, this visits today largely conform to what you can see here. So Peter Addiman described this format as a carefully programmed sequential experience designed to build up in logical steps an understanding of Viking York, the archaeological process, and the significance both of the Viking contribution to the city's history and the archaeologist's role in elucidating it. So there have been a certain amount of visitor-facing research done at the time of the Coppergate dig that demonstrated a lot of visitors had a lot of misconceptions about the Viking period. They thought it came before the Roman period, for instance. They thought about horns on helmets, all of these kinds of things, and there was a belief that York could do part of the job towards correcting some of those ideas. That was certainly in their minds. So we've got 1,500 square meters here. You start with an oriented descent. You start with an orientation area here. You have a ride, more about this later. Then you exit and walk through a gallery space. And then you exit through the gift shop. It's been in format since 1984. So in terms of inspirations, living history sites, particularly colonial Williamsburg in America, these were sources of inspiration for Peter Addiman. The JORVIK project team also visited Disney World to consider things like people management, psychology of queuing, transport systems, commercial enterprise and technology. The Museum of the City of New York was influential as well, because that had pioneered what they described as a brilliant introductory objects, music and light show using Broadway techniques and cutting edge technology. Okay, let's have the next slide, please. So we can start to zero in on some of the features of JORVIK version 1. What we see here is the first image from the ride. You can see the time cars here. There's always been a ride as part of JORVIK. These were devised as a means of regulating flow through an underground attraction, principally because of fire regulation concerns. So this was the way of achieving flow. So a group called Yorkshire Communications Group, who the led by Colin Pyra, who went on to have quite a glittering career in heritage attractions, and John Sunderland, who's the designer. They sort of put their heads together. Colin Pyra's background was in newspapers in Wakefield, so and John Sunderland's background was as a designer for TV and film. And does anyone remember 321?
Yeah.
Quiz show on ITV. Dusty Bin.
Yeah.
One of John Sunderland's claims to fame is that he designed Dusty Bin. That's not the 321. Another project he worked on while he was working on Yorvik was a Kenny Everett movie, a comedy horror movie starring Vincent Price called Bloodbath at the House of Death. Don't bother watching it. I watched it, so you don't have to. So this was their background, and John Sunderland's idea for Yorvik, and this is really foundational for Yorvik, was that when you visited, you should be like your own TV camera, travelling through, and he thought it in very audiovisual and cinematic terms. You would travel through and you would capture sights and sounds that would be part of your experience. And so other influences then came in later, but that was his idea. And so we have here the time tunnel, and initially what you would do is you would go backwards in your time capsule down the time tunnel. This is another of John Sunderland's ideas that came to quite late in the process. And you would go past these figures who represented different stages in York's history, before finally, when you reach the end of the time tunnel, you turn around and head off forwards through the Viking city, whose the date line for the Viking city was 948 AD. These figures were designed by Derek and Patricia Freeborn, sculptors, and again they did lots of work for TV and film. The film credit that I'm most aware of them having is they designed the space cruise helmets for Ridley Scott's Alien. It's very distinctive, headgear. So the Freeborns did the models in the time tunnel. Let's have the next slide, please, and we get into the nitty-gritty of Yorvik, the reconstruction based on the archaeological evidence. So again, Yorvik has always had this claim that it bases everything that it does on the archaeological evidence from the big dig site. And the houses have been re-erected on more or less on the spot where they were uncovered, and the people who live and work within them are doing the kinds of things that the Vikings back in the 10th century would have been doing back in those days as well. All kinds of people were involved in this reconstruction. I don't think anything quite like this had been attempted before. So specialists like thatchers, potters, sailmakers, metalworkers, taxidermists, the figures by a sculptor called Graham Iverson. I don't know if you've come across him. He's had a glittering career. This is one of his first commissions. But in terms of producing public art and sculptures, life-size sculptures of popular figures, he has been the go-to person. So he did the famous Eric Morecambe one that's at Morecambe, various other commissions, Les Dawson and Liver St Anne's, lots and lots of commissions of sports people. The big case sculpture as well, which I think is in possibly in Barnsley. I had the pleasure of meeting Graham for the first time on Friday, because I've been speaking to members of the Yorvik One project team for the anniversary. So he had produced the figures in his very distinctive style. The smells, they were brought in, they were produced by a firm called Dale Air, you might have heard of, producer of synthetic smells. We still use smells essentially by the same companies, now called Aroma Prime. I think we were one of the first to use, certainly one of the first heritage sites to use synthetic smells. And there were a variety to sort of encapsulate different areas of the scene. And there was a soundtrack as well. So there was a composer called Trevor Wishart, again, very active professional composer, York-based, very well known for electronic music, but he put together a soundscape that sort of an ambient soundscape that evoked the sounds of a busy city as you travel through. So it was really only one street's worth. The idea was to evoke the idea of a much bigger city. Let's have the next scene, please. So once you've gone through the street scene, you then went round the corner, past the wharf scene, back down the other way, and through a reconstruction of the excavation with mannequin archaeologists. So essentially in Yorvik 1, you saw the reconstruction of the houses, and then you saw what the houses looked like when they were under excavation, how we have the evidence for the houses that we then constructed. We've slightly turned that on its head now because we show a reconstruction of the excavation before you see the reconstruction of the Viking era landscape. Okay, next slide, please. Then you would get off the time car, you would walk through a reconstruction of conservation lab, again with mannequin figures, doing the kinds of processes that archaeologists would do when they're not doing field work, other things that they were involved with. And then next one, please. The Skipper Gallery. So the first gallery at Yorvik was named in Skipper, who'd been so influential. Let's have the next slide, please. Which is the queue outside Yorvik. So Yorvik was a smash hit when it opened, and really went on to dominate debates around museums and heritage for probably 10 years after it opened. Quite polarising in some ways. I think the archaeologists and everyone who attached their name to the Yorvik project, it was a massive risk, and some people within academia, in archaeology, were quite snippy about York. That's the best way I can think of terming it. They felt it was a dumbing down, or a Disneyfication is another term that was used. You were taking the burden of interpretation away from your audiences and your visitors, rather than saying to visitors, look in that case, now imagine what that might have been. Yorvik was doing the job for them. It was saying, don't bother imagining, we'll show you exactly what it's like. So that was one of the sort of criticisms that was made aimed at Yorvik. But really, Yorvik, it won by force of its success. So that polarising debate was either museums saying, we don't want to be anything like Yorvik, it's a terrible idea, or we're going to be the next Yorvik. We can do this in our town, anywhere you like, and we can replicate this, do something similar, we will be the next Yorvik. That didn't work out for a lot of Yorvik's closest imitators. I don't know exactly why. There's probably a PhD that could be done on that, but there were a lot of them, the majority of which haven't continued to this day. So there were just under 900,000 in each of its first 2 years of operation. So you imagine those first projections, 500,000, it's completely blew it all away. So Yorvik really has been the goose that has laid the golden egg for York Archaeological Trust for a long time now. Let's have the next slide, please. I'm just accelerating slightly because I'm around time. But Yorvik around this time, the York Archaeological Trust was innovating in a number of ways. This is the heritage shop that opened in 1983. So the tourism to the Coppergate Dig and the selling of gifts around gift items and souvenirs around the Coppergate Dig really gave the idea that this was another commercial activity that the trust could engage in. So it had a souvenir shop that I'm told gave birth to the idea of pastimes. Remember the pastimes shop? That again went out of business about 10 years ago. But this predated pastimes. Should we have the next slide, please? There was a mail order catalogue. Here are some of the items that were available in 1982, I think. The Eric Blood Axe rule's okay. I've just been talking to a colleague actually saying we should put these on sale again during the 40th anniversary year. People still talk about their Eric Blood Axe rule's okay t-shirts. Let's have the next slide, please. We've had the JORVIK Viking Festival as well, in one form or another since 1985. So this has really dominated my Februaries for the last 20 years. When we had lots of people coming to the city. We used to have a regatta on the River Ouse. We had participants, particularly from Norway, who would come to take part in the regatta. Boats have featured. Let's have the next slide, please. And also reenactors, so people from the reenactment fraternity who have an impact on how our activities have developed. We generally have a battle reenactment in the middle of York. So this one is on the Eye of York, just next to Clifford's Tower. And next slide, please. And we have other attractions as well now. The Archaeological Resource Centre opened in 1990. And the main idea for this was it was to be a space that the school groups who were visiting Yorvik, they could use it for schools workshops. So it was a place to host those school groups that were coming along to Yorvik. It has continued. It's now called DIG. We branded this DIG in 2006. But the idea here is that it's a hands-on experience. You get to be hands-on with various things that archaeologists do. So in ARC, it was looking at microscopic slides or sorting through bulk finds. Nowadays in DIG, you have a go at digging through a reconstructed archaeological dig. Let's have the next slide, please. Okay, so if we go back to Yorvik, I can give you a sort of a quick run through of some of the key changes in Yorvik over the years. So this is Graham Iverson's version of Eamon the Fisherman, one of the residents of the Viking Street of Coppergate. And if you go to the next slide from here, he was replaced with this version of Eamon in 1991. So this was with help from University College Hospital London. And this was the first step in a programme to replace the heads of the figures with high-tech models featuring the faces of real 10th century people. So using skulls and that come from an early medieval cemetery in York, and these techniques from University College Hospital London, faces were reconstructed and applied to the residents of the Viking Age Coppergate. And so there were many of the Iverson sculptures were replaced in the course of the 1990s. Okay, next slide, please. Barley Hall came along in the mid 1990s, opened in 1993. This is our reconstructed medieval townhouse. And at this point in the Trust's history, we start to hit some problems. We're around the time now of the 1990s recession. You remember that in the early 90s, we were in a recession. And it was at this time, Barley Hall had just opened. There were big plans for how it would operate like Yorvik, or more like a living history attraction. Reconstructed medieval townhouse, redressed to look like it might have done in 1483, occupied by costumed staff who were doing all the kinds of things they would do in the course of a day, changing their activities according to the seasons and the feast days and all of this sort of thing. And it just wasn't financially viable, it wasn't workable. And so I think it was sort of 94 possibly, mid-90s, Barley Hall got mothballed. It's now operational again, thank goodness. Barley Hall got mothballed, but we lost our heritage shop that I showed you, and a couple of other heritage souvenir outlets that we've got in York as well. Okay, next slide, please. Happier times. In 2000, Yorvik closed, and it was estimated that the old time cars had covered about 70,000 miles in the course of their lifetime. And this is an issue with Yorvik, because the ride gets old. So our current ride is approaching a quarter of a century in age now. So, but this is an issue. The aim with the first refurbishment, and this was a piece of these graphics were produced around the time when Yorvik 2 came to be. The aim was to create a greatly refined, and completely up-to-date view of part of the Viking Age town. So some of the feedback from Yorvik 1, the impression given was that it was a Viking village. People would say in their feedback how I enjoyed the Viking village. That's not the idea, it's not a village. It's one street in a much bigger Viking city. York was a city, an urban place, at a time when there weren't many urban places at all in the British Isles. So it was key to get this idea across that York is a city. So 16 new figures were added. Some used animatronics for the first time when York opened in April 2001. Again, the figures, they were based on skeletal evidence from early medieval York. In most cases, not this one. Does anyone recognise this Viking? He's a TV personality, and the clue is in his not entirely authentic blue Peter badge. It's Matt Baker.
Oh, Matt Baker.
So he's been on the set until fairly recently. He suffers a bit of well, actually, he doesn't suffer a silence, but I'll come on to it. New artifacts gallery with cases on the things of leatherworking, hearth and home, woodworking, and blacksmithing. And from 2006, these cases incorporated our Artifacts Alive presentations, which now feature in fearsome craftsmen here, the talking heads.
Oh, yeah.
Vikings. So you can see the Vikings that they speak in Yorkshire dialect, talk about their work, their working, woodworking, etc. New gallery space for temporary exhibitions. This is the shop was moved upstairs, and the new gallery space was created, and our interactive team. So costume interactives become a fixture really in Yorvik. Their role is greatly expanded, and they're now a really important part of the offer to visitors. They're not reenactors in that they perform all the functions of gallery staff, as well as being costume Viking characters. And they will tend to speak to people about Vikings in the third person. It's not the case of they'll walk up to you and say, "It's not strangely nice, you've got anyone." Yes, it's not. But they will switch modes depending on who they're speaking to. So that might be more appropriate for a school age audience, for instance. So they're very good. And this is JORVIK 3, which opened in, this was a two-stage refurbishment between 2009 and 2011. Part of a citywide bid to increase visits to the city in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis. We have the glass floor here, which you now see when you first enter Yorvik, with the reconstruction of the Coppergate Dig underneath it. We started to use skeletal evidence around the turn of the century, and again, this has a greater role in York today. This skeleton is one of 4 burials found at Coppergate, 2 of which were complete, and there was another skull as well. It wasn't a burial ground, there were these burials found at Coppergate. And for JORVIK 3, a reconstruction was done, this one by the University of Dundee's Centre for Anatomy and Human Identification. So they do a lot of work with the police, for instance, for putting faces to the remains of unknown murder victims, for instance. So this is our Coppergate woman, and her skeleton was looked at in great detail. We know a great deal about her from looking at the skeletal evidence and isotopic analysis as well. Again, we don't know what her name was, we don't know what language she spoke, we don't know what she called herself, which god she worshipped, we don't know any of that stuff. We do have other kinds of insights into her life. So we flooded at the end of 2015, when York flooded. We never flooded before. We were closed for 16 months, during which time we mounted a big cleanup operation and completely reimagined Yorvik. And we're operational again by April 2017, and you see the ride in action again here. And our interactive staff now with a new spot on the set. There's Amond in his latest incarnation. So the animatronics now, the first time, well, these are from life formations of Ohio, who specialise in very lifelike animatronics. So what in contrast with Graham Iverson's almost cartoonish figures, we've now got these very realistic looking figures with a great range of movements in their spatial features and their limbs. But again, with the face based on the reconstruction done on the very medieval skeletons. So for the latest refurbishment, we have 23 new animatronic figures put in, including one to represent the Coppergate woman. So having reconstructed her for the first time when Yorvik underwent its second refurbishment, we've now got her reconstructed in animatronic form. And I'm running out of time slightly because I want to give you 10 minutes or so for questions. I heard off maybe someone's school, unfortunately. But this is our artifacts gallery as it looks now. And what do you notice in the front case here? Our sock. So the sock that I showed you, found in the Coppergate Dig, it still features as one of our key finds. And as we're a blended event today, we've got people joining us online. The last note that I've got is on our 2021 Viking Festival, which we did wholly online. Because we were all locked down at this point, everyone was having a thoroughly miserable time. I've got 2 primary age children at home, attempting to homeschool them and have them remotely schooled from home, from their classroom, and people were thoroughly fed up and very keen to have lots of online things available. And it landed at just the right time. mid-February, a bunch of online events. So we did all of our festival events online, and there's a real appetite for it. So I was really pleased that we were able to provide this. It was one of those where we felt we were exactly in the right place at the right time. And I've just included this here as this is probably one of my proudest memories really of my time working for Yorvik, is feeling that we've made a really important contribution through switching to the digital model during the festival. Right, actually,
That clock's 5 minutes fast.
oh, is it?
Yeah,
Oh, right, okay. Well, we've got slightly longer than expected.
I was just looking, thinking, I'm sure it's not.
Yeah. So I'm going to talk through the last slides a bit more quickly than I did the first ones. Does anyone have any questions at all about any of that?
Yeah, so I was recently in Berlin last year and they had a gig where there was some kind of related stuff. And they found rune sticks. I wonder if any rune sticks were found in Tuckley.
That's a really good question. I'm not aware of anything with a runic inscription coming out of Coppergate.
Yeah.
No, I don't think there is. Are you aware of anything else?
I can't think of anything, so.
No.
Just if you do find something like that, because obviously you know it's language.
Yes.
Then you didn't know what language they spoke.
No, we've got a dedication stone from the church next door, which has an inscription in Old English and Latin. So the reasonable assumption that those languages would have been in use. But we imagine that the language being used, and certainly that we've used in the reconstruction that you hear as you travel around, is Old Norse.
Yeah.
In fact, it's a mixture. On the Yorvik set now, you hear a mixture of Old Norse, Old English. Those are the two principal ones. You also hear Latin, Old Irish, Middle Welsh, and Sogdian. So we've got our Arab trader figure. He's sort of muttering to himself in Sogdian. He's lost his silk samples on the way to market. So yeah, it's quite a mixture. Yeah.
That it's obviously it's an experiential thing, and that I can remember going to the Wheel of the Downland over there, and but I don't know about the time. I mean, obviously that sort of thing we can have at the same sort of time. Do you know if Yorvik took inspiration from the art, the museums that were like that?
Oh, no doubt it did. Yeah. I think Yorvik was original in a lot of ways, but within its DNA, you can trace other museums and tourist attractions. The other thing I became aware of relatively recently was a TV series called Living in the Past from the late 70s, and it was almost like the first reality TV show. It was about a bunch of people going and living an Iron Age life, and the camera crew would come back to them periodically, have a look and see how they were.
Not doing very well with the wrong picking and things like that.
So all of that is going on as well at this time. But I think, yeah, you get the birth of the heritage industry as well in the 80s. And I don't know the degree to which Yorvik shaped that or was shaped by it. I think there's probably other things going on as well. I think certainly Yorvik and then the projects that were spun off from it and the careers that spun off from it seem to indicate that Yorvik was a keystone in the UK heritage industry and the heritage industry further afield, because a lot of the members of that project team, they then created their own businesses and worked all over the world in tourism and attractions, and they've had whole careers in that line of work since that have, from what I can tell, paid very well. So I think it's a really interesting time, and I do go back as well, because sometimes I look at what we have now at Yorvik and I think, well, why have we got that? Or why did we decide to do that in that way? And sometimes you can work it out by going back and sifting through the evidence and the notes. Often it's more difficult. You know, it's difficult to work out why a personal choice has been made, or something's been amplified, or something else has been pushed to one side.
There's definitely been like the spin-off from my experience of working in museums and venues that I go to. So I worked at the Hull and Shrider Museum and Celtic World, there, it's directly influenced by the fact that Yorvik's just down the road. And then when we worked with Colin when we did the Roman gallery when I was there, and then the Anglo-Saxon, the medieval galleries upstairs, we worked with his company. So it's like a direct response to the fact that you've got something so interactive, moving from having cases and panels to having walking through an Iron Age village.
And that's an interesting one as well, because we sometimes get people who say to us, how long's it been arrived? Because I remember walking through York. To my knowledge, the only people who've walked through York are the people who came for a sneak preview before it opened properly in 1984. Occasional after hours buy a ticket, and this is your VIP chance to see behind the scenes. Very recently, when we had a problem with the ride, and we operated walking tours instead. But I think they might be remembering Cornish Riding Museum.
Yeah.
That's interesting as well. You know, it's how people experience and remember these things, and often their memories are odd to what we know about the places. It's quite interesting.
About the reconstruction of the places, are they all done with skulls found at Yorvik, or are they of the same period but elsewhere?
They're from the Fishergate Cemetery
Right.
in York. I think they were all based on the Fishergate excavations that were going around the mid 1980s, the early 90s. So that provided a set. So there was an effort to use those as the basis for the reconstructions in the 1990s, and we've continued to use those for some of the models. Some of them are off the peg. So with life formations, some of them are off the peg. I think Winston Churchill might be in there. I think he's our vegetable seller. Another one is a competition winner. So when we were doing fundraising for the refurbishment of York, we called that Campaign Canute, because Canute is the Viking king who famously tried to turn away the waves, and obviously that didn't work for him and didn't work at York. So as part of that it was a competition to become one of the new Vikings on the set of York. So we do have a competition winner on there. We do have the former director of attractions; she's on there as well. So it's some still are based on Fishergate, and then Coppergate, of course, is from Coppergate. So those are the only two sets of skeletal remains that we've used for the reconstructions. Yeah,
Not related. What happened with the flooding? And you said it's in a concrete area, so you find memories. Have done any sort of tanking or anything like that?
yes, and for a long time, I don't think they quite knew where the waters had come in. I think it was suspected the loading bay area outside had flooded. There's an overflow from the River Foss, and I think it come up there. But I think the quantities were just so great because the Foss barrier had failed and been lifted. Nothing would have prevented it in the end. So yes, it was hacked, and the waters were held at bay for a while, but it was so severe that eventually it couldn't be held off anymore.
Any more questions? Oh, thank you very much. That was fascinating, very interesting.